On today's episode of Thrive Forward, we welcome Jael Kerandi. I first experienced her as she made a brave and bold statement as the student body president of the University of Minnesota. I know in my experiences as a young leader, sometimes I was questioned with how I approach different things and oh geez, don't you know you have to do things this way or that way? As I have become a leader myself, I have truly listened to those voices that maybe aren't always heard. And the generations to follow me actually truly inspire me. Their differences, how they look at life, and how they truly strive to thrive forward. So, on today's podcast, Jael and I talk very intimately about really tough topics, and especially hard-hitting for young folks. But really, they impact us all. And the leaders within these activism topics like equity and homelessness and police brutality and overall politics at this point in time, we touch on all of those different topics and why, at the end of the day, humanity is what truly matters. So I ask you to tune into this episode with an open mind and an open heart. What can you learn from our young people who are the future and are leaders now and leading us into the future forward? Let's dive into, for those that don't know you, share a little bit about kind of how you have taken this step in 2020 into just a vast leadership role, nationally recognized leadership role as well.
No, absolutely. I'd be happy to share. So I was originally born in Nairobi, Kenya, and moved here when I was about 18 months old. So I moved to the States when I was a baby. And I'm the youngest child, so very young group of children and my parents and I. And it was really just an opportunity for us to get into education. But my father really wanted to put us in the best position moving forward. So what could we do after our studies? And we moved around the United States a little bit, but landed in Minnesota and have lived here ever since for almost 20 years now, somewhere in that range. Very long time.
Yeah.
But in terms of leadership and really being at the University of Minnesota, I knew I wanted to join student government. I was super excited to do so. And that first year kind of joined on as an intern, moved into a couple of different roles working with our board of regents and athletics. And then I ran for vice president actually on a ticket. And we were successful. And in that, I then, I want to say December, our president resigned of our then student association, and I immediately assumed all of those responsibilities immediately, which was definitely a party, and was working with students then. And then the pandemic hit, right? Nobody was expecting a pandemic. Nobody could have predicted what students would need in that time. So it honestly was a constant for me, figuring out what students needed and how quickly we could get it to them. In that time, and everyone was working overtime trying to make that happen. And our terms end in July, so I was actively in the role. The role started to kind of wind down as the school year was winding down, but then unfortunately, we saw the murder of George Floyd then happened in Minneapolis, and I felt it was my immediate responsibility to respond to that, knowing where our campus was, knowing where our students were living, knowing that 2/3 of our university is Minnesotans, and it was important to me to say something to make sure that our university understood that we by no means stand by such behaviors, nor find parallel to the values of the Minneapolis Police Department. And so in that, it was really a hope to be able to make sure that our students knew. And I asked our university to stop working in all its facets with the Minneapolis Police Department and make sure that they understood that things like that were not okay.
Yeah, you made a very bold statement as a student body president. And I will say this, that was my first interaction with you via media. I had not met you. And I was so inspired by seeing you step out in such grace and leadership, but also just a direct call to action. And I think that that is something that I've talked about on our podcast too, as George Floyd, just like Al Sharpton shared in his funeral, the reason why his death stood out even more so is everybody was home. And and their screens were up in front of them because they were paying attention to the news because they were looking at what was happening with COVID, right? And now all of a sudden they're watching a Black man murdered on their screen. And that created a lot of conversation in several different households, some who had been having that conversation for a long time, and some who were having the conversations for the first time. How do you feel like that has impacted you, both as a leader, but also as a student? We can't ignore the fact that you're still going to school and you're still, in your 20s and you're like at this space in life, right? And tell us more about how that has impacted you.
Yeah, I think there's definitely the difficulty of saying, okay, I need to manage, right, what's going on with our campus, what's going on, but also wrapping up your academics at that time. And I also think there's the part of you that remembers kind of like, this is not an anomaly, right? Like, this is not the first time this has happened. It's not the first time it happened in Minneapolis. And so it's kind of this feeling of until when, right? Like, what is that line? When do we say stop? Like, how much more evidence is necessary? How many more quote unquote trainings need to happen? When do people find humanity in the Black life, right? And so there's a pause that, or this reckoning you have with yourself, and you think, okay, I'm going to school, I'm doing all these things, but I could just end up dead. Right? Like I'm constantly working towards these things. I have an internship, I'm doing this, but to the police, to them, I'm just a Black person, right? Like, doesn't matter what class you're in, it doesn't matter what your income is, it doesn't matter where you come from. The Black men and Black women are disproportionately killed by the police, right?
I actually had the same conversation with one of my girlfriends who grew up over South. We didn't grow up together. We actually are parents and live in the same community now. And she's a Black woman living in I live in St. Anthony. I live in a mainly white community with its own policing problems. And so she and I had this long conversation, and she had shared with me, she was like, I'm doing all of the right things, yet on the outside, like, I'm doing all the things I was always told that I had to do, and it still doesn't feel like it's good enough. So
Right.
how are you building that mindset forward and that change of action forward so that we can affect change in a different way? And what pieces of advice do you have to us old stick in the muds that maybe need to change a little bit? And maybe I won't include myself in that, but I would say old stick in the muds, or people that are
No,
just learning.
Right. And I think what I find sometimes difficult is racism isn't new, right? Like, it's to some extent, it's somewhat shocking to me, this reckoning that has happened this summer, as if there's this call to, like, all of a sudden it exists. And I think what people are realizing is, or what maybe people were reckoning with, yeah, it exists, but people didn't want to say it exists in Minnesota, right? People didn't want to say it exists in our liberal state. People didn't want to say that we had these individuals in our society, or that this was possible. And so to people who maybe are coming to the call of action or coming to an understanding of racism, I think there's the grander, this is systemic, right? This isn't the egregious actions that people are believing is the only thing that can be classified as racism. It's in our systems, it's in our healthcare, it's innate in education, it's in our housing system, right? We could go back and look at deeds that said white only, right? And how that pushed the neighborhood, right? Why our suburbs look the way they do. And then we can talk about what happened in St. Paul with redlining, and why it looks the way it looks today, and what they did when they went through the highway. So I think there's so many ways that we can go back and look at our system. And to people who are maybe just learning, I ask one, look in your local community. Unfortunately, I can probably guarantee you, if you went through your systems, or you looked at your housing, or you look at healthcare, or you looked at how the lines are drawn, you'd start to see how some of these things disproportionately affect Black and brown people. And then the second thing I would say is, please don't expect your Black friends to be the educator. And yes, have those conversations with them if they're willing to have them. I think that is wonderful, especially for people that you know are being genuine in that effect. But there is so much literature, there are so many opportunities for education, and we live in a time where resources in terms of knowledge aren't as scarce as they used to be, right? It's not necessarily the book that we have to go read or page through. We can do a quick Google search and find whatever it is that you want to find. And then have those conversations with your friends and gain their perspective. Because what you just said, even about your friend talking to you and saying, this is what I'm trying to do, right? This is what I've been pushing for. It gives you the opportunity to empathize, right? It gives you the opportunity to see a perspective that you haven't had to live through. And that is so important. But that perspective is gained only if you've taken the time to get the knowledge prior to. And so that is very important. In terms of what I think of moving forward or what the mindset shift has to be is, for me, it can be very easy to sit in a place and say, but does what I do right now even matter? Right? Like, even if I do this step, even if I go this way, all paths seem to lead to one place. And people have asked me, they're like, do you think we've lost hope? And I said, if I lost hope, I wouldn't be doing it anymore, right? That I have to keep going because there's something in me that believes that one day this will change. And if I don't do it, then what I'm saying to my children and my children's children and their children is they weren't enough to fight for, because there's people that came before me that fought so hard and felt like I was worth fighting for. So for those that are going to come after me, I have to do the same. And we will slowly continue to move the needle. And it's not a matter of does it happen today or tomorrow, right? It's a marathon, not a sprint. And so the marathon will continue. It's going to keep continuing. We're going to keep passing the baton until we cross the finish line. So to people, I keep saying, keep the hope, keep the faith. And when you're tired, tap somebody else in, right? Let it be a relay race. Get somebody else in. And then when you're ready and you can feel revamped, go again. We can pause, but we can't be complacent. We can't sit in that. This is never going to change. It will change. I have confidence it will change, but we have to keep fighting.
Yeah, we have to keep the dialogue open. I had an episode that aired this week where we talked about keeping the dialogue open, and not making it a competition of who's winning, but how do we keep that dialogue open with somebody that might not necessarily agree or come from the same understanding. And you talked about empathetic conversation and empathizing. I will say this, as a white person, I will never feel what you feel.
Right.
I will never experience what you experience. However, it is my duty to listen and listen to understand. And I think we oftentimes listen to rebut or listen to respond rather than just listen to understand somebody else's experience. And I think from both and, right? I've got a strong connection in rural cities. And I have a good friend of mine who runs nonprofits in rural spaces, because there's a lot of hurt in those spaces right now too. Now, very different. And so that's where I think the hurt has to have the conversation of, what is the source? What is happening there? So how do we affect that? You have a passion for policy and a passion for finance and a passion for marketing, and you're graduating senior from the University of Minnesota Carlson School of Management, which is a feat in itself. Because that is, I mean, anybody who doesn't know Carlson School of Management is a rigorous academic process. So I commend you for that. Now you've done all of these things and you still feel like, okay, I got to keep going. I have the hope. How do you bring all of those passions together? What does this look like for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a space to be an activist wherever you are. I think there's a place in which you can bring forth a perspective people haven't heard of, or you start to push the needle in a different way, right? When we talk about the inequity or the wealth gap that we see in corporate, and we see really across our institutions, and how people are compensated, right? Like by pushing the needle, right? And you start to be in places or in spaces in which you can increase compensation, in which you can hire and retain talent, then you start to be in a position of which you can start to assert, you can start to be the change in that specific institution. Now, does it always have to happen from the inside out? No, absolutely not. But I think what I found is thinking to myself is, how do I then get to wherever I end up after college and make change there, right? So I'm a business student and I was leading the student body. Many people usually find parallel with poli-sci or maybe your pre-law students being in student government, but I was very excited to be there, right? There's a way you can take your skills and make them transferable. That could also look like taking my knowledge from business and helping others to gain that same knowledge, right? Financial literacy is one of the things that I believe all of us struggle with, but I specifically want to make sure that my people, my community, are able to assert this knowledge and utilize it. And it's not from a lack of capability, it's not from a lack of understanding, but to some extent, I really do believe it's a lack of availability and actually a suppression of the knowledge, right? So how do I remake that knowledge available so that we're able to progress this forward? And so some of these skills are very transferable. They matter. And how do you start to say, okay, if this is a community, right? When we're talking about how housing works and how it impacts education, then in that school, do they have business classes? Do they have financial literacy classes that we're starting with high school schoolers with, right? Teaching our high school students about these different things, and how can I go back and help there? So I think they aren't necessarily all in the same lane at all, but I do my best to make them work.
Well, I had somebody once tell me in my career to stop being a jack of all trades because I would be a master of none. And to that person, I rolled my eyes and walked in the other direction and pursued all of my passions, because I think we can start to bring those things together. And I think that that's what's so great about the millennial and Gen Z. I am on the cusp of the millennial generation, so I will claim them. Although early in my career, people were like, who are these millennials? We don't know what to do with them. So you might run up against that a little bit as you enter into your career. But I will say you've got the right mindset as you step into that space, because we do need more of the both and we need more creativity in a business sense and more business sense in a creative sense, right? They have to come together to be able to, for us to move forward and looking outside of the box and not pigeonholing ourselves into one space, because that's not how change actually happens.
Right.
So you mentioned a lot about financial literacy, and of course, money's my thing. I love talking about it. What's your definition of wealth, and how did you come across your level of understanding to get to that space?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think very early on, people would use being rich and being wealthy interchangeably, very early on. And I think and I think it was maybe looking at what was classified or who was classified as wealthy and kind of seeing what that meant compared to somebody they said that was rich. And often what I felt was, one, the person who was rich or wealthy, rarely felt like they were wealthy, right? In the sense of, you never looked at them and said, you are a wealthy person, right? I never was been like, oh, I could pinpoint you off the street and be like, this person's extremely wealthy. And that was one thing I was noted, was one appearance. For what it's worth, I don't necessarily know or what weight that carried, but that was always a differentiation I felt. The second thing was, to those who are wealthy, if you looked at their portfolio of whatever made them wealthy, it sustained itself, right? It was continuous, but it tended not to be the only thing they were doing, right? There was not this eggs in one basket type of thing. It might have started that way, but it seemed that then their wealth multiplied itself, right? It felt very exponential. It felt like it just kind of kept going. And then the other thing was, it was in abundance. It was definitely in abundance. It always felt like, do you really need that much money? And I'm talking about wealth in its monetary sense, recognizing that I've also, as I think my parents, my father is a physician, and wealth in terms of how healthy you are physically, mentally, psychologically, is very important in our family. And so the often saying is, your health is wealth too, right?
Yes.
So like, how many walks are you going on a day? How much fresh air? My mom would like come in my room and she's like, you need to open the blinds. I don't know what's going on in here, but open the blinds. Or making sure that we were all eating a very well-balanced diet. My mom was a vegan. It was very important to her. And so to me, I've seen wealth in so many different ways, but it's the two that I've really grappled with are your health, definitely, but also in its monetary sense.
Yeah. Oh, I love. Are you in my brain? These are things that I've always talked to people about, and I focus on with my clients, because I think it's so important. We can have this monetary sense of wealth or keeping up with the Joneses aspect of things. Right. I usually always say, well, the Joneses bought it on credit, so how do you know that's actually accumulated wealth? It is, until you have this internal instinct of wealth, and this grounding of yourself and your mindset, and And that comes with your physical health and your mental health.
Right.
Those are so beautiful aspects of things, that you can have all the money in the world and not be happy. You can have all the money in the world and try to buy happiness. You can also not have any money and be totally happy.
Absolutely.
So money doesn't necessarily define, but I always say it's a tool in our toolbox to be
Right.
successful, to get to the places that we want to go to.
Absolutely.
How do you feel like those learned instincts or those sayings or experiences kind of manifested and molded what you believe about money, and how has that kind of impacted you?
Absolutely. I think because my parents have been very focused on, yes, I want you to be financially stable, right? The idea is I want to be able to give you the
Absolutely.
best opportunity to sustain yourself. Um, but they've also very much focused on who you are as a person, right? Your character is, how you treat people, what you do, and how you present yourself when you're in the world should feel more important to you. There's this verse, my family is very religious, and there's this verse in the Bible that talks about a good name is better than great riches.
Mhm.
And my dad often reminded us that like your reputation will always precede you, and that's not always made up of how much money you make. That's made up of how you treat people. That's made up of how you respect people when you walk into the room. That's how you greet people. And so very early on, what more so we were taught was how are you as a person? What is your character? If somebody was to meet me on the street and was talking about you and didn't know I was your father, what would they tell me? And that's what brings you wealth, right? That's what's going to give you life. That's what in your old age you're going to look back on, and people are going to be there for you because of that. And because we're in the Kenyan culture and in many African countries, the village raises the child, right? The village is very important to the child, right? As you grow older, then it's the same idea that then you take care of the elderly because they took care of you. So
Mhm.
also the respect you give them as you grow older, they will then start to respect you. And so very early on, I think it was very focused on our character development because that to us was what wealth was associated with. It was who are you as a person. My dad often said, show me your friends and I'll tell you your character, because it's a company that you keep.
Mhm.
It's your values. It's how that's going to manifest in all that you do. And then I think there's always a part of, if you're a good person, right? If you have this character and you work hard, does it always happen the first time? No. Does the nice person, quote unquote, always win? Absolutely not. But slow and easy will win the race. It's not, and in this, the Swahili saying is kutangulia sikufika. So the idea is like to reach there first doesn't mean you've made it, right?
Oh,
It's
that's
about
beautiful.
it's about getting to the finish line, and you'll get there. So I think that's how I've kind of always taken it. No, have I always been first in everything? Absolutely not. Have I gotten every opportunity I've applied for? No chance. But it's this idea of like, if I do my best with how I treat people and the character that I have, the wealth that I aim for, or in whatever facet, whether it's happiness and monetarily, it will come.
Yeah. Oh, that's so beautiful. I think that's, I mean, for me, I grew up with kind of a very similar aspect of character. And a lot of it comes from my grandfather, he was also the most genuine, humble man I've ever met in my entire life. And he could have not been humble given his career and what he had done in his life, but he was. He was very quiet. He put himself behind, the curtain and was like, "This is just, me." He's like 5'2", tiny Jewish man. He's fantastic. But that sense of understanding, and I lived with him, so I had a multi-generational family, which is not necessarily something that we experience a lot in white culture in America, but it's very common worldwide to have that same element. And my mom grew up with my great grandmother in the house, and like my husband and I did an addition on the house, and I joke with him like someday my mother will live here, and he's like, "What?" Not, Mom, no, we'll take care of you. You'll have another space to live. I love you, but you'll have another space to live. Or you'll live here if we need to. But we've also, we've lived with my husband's parents, and having that Again, it is so much about that experience of who are you? I remember my father-in-law saying to my husband and I the day we got married, he's like, I'm so grateful to have gotten to know the friends that you have because it helps me to understand the two of you so much better, right?
Right.
And I think that that's so key as we start to have these conversations again about change. When you have those relationships, it creates even more greater in-depth conversation. And before you and I hit record today, we were talking about some of the passions looking forward into 2021 that we're going to focus on. The big quote unquote election is hopefully past us. And we can move on from that space and move forward. Let's talk a little bit about some of those passions that you have and how maybe you can call to action some of the individuals, especially locally here in the Twin Cities, towards some of the causes that might be important to you.
Absolutely. I think one at a university level, I just think people have to really figure out, especially our university administrators or really anyone that feels like they have a stake in the University of Minnesota, is what are you doing for the community, right? Like, how are you serving the community? The university is servient of the state. And I think to hold on to that land grant mission, we need to see action on those words. And they have to be in parallel with the values, especially in diversity, equity, and inclusion that they name. So anyone who has a stake in the university, I would urge them to get in contact with university administrators, get in contact with individuals who have a stake here, if you're a donor, whatever the case may be, but really look into, is that servient mission being carried out? The second thing I would say is really looking towards local elections, right? We understand, like she just mentioned, we are hopefully past the presidential election, but it's very important to remember that the individuals who are making the decisions that impact our everyday life, right, live down the street from us.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
there are city council members, there are representatives, there are senators, they're members in the governor's cabinet. How are we talking with those individuals to make sure that we are getting what we need in our state? That means going to a city council meeting. That could be writing a letter to our state legislators. I've done so before and I have received responses. So I really do encourage people to do that. And sometimes it can feel like, how much does this move the media? How much does it matter? And it does matter, right? Because we voted them in. There is no elected representative without the individuals that elected them. And so we have the internal power to say, this is somebody I voted for. And if I voted for you based on what you said, I get to hold you to that, because that's the promise that you gave me, right? That was an unprovoked promise that you shared with me and asked, and now I'm going to ask you to give good on that promise. And I think we need to do more of that. And our elected officials need to understand, it's not I get into office and wait for campaigning. It's that I get into office, I do the job that I promised the people I would do, and then I continue to do that job. Because I think often politics is very pinned up as a matter of hierarchy, a matter of power, when in fact it's servant leadership, or it should be servant leadership. And so what we need to see is more servant leaders. And if those are not the individuals that are willing to serve the people, then we need to stop voting for them. We cannot vote on precedent. We cannot vote on what sounds nice. We need to vote on the policies that will benefit our people in the state. We are all taxpayers. We are all putting money right into our legislators, right? And what we want to see is Minnesota be a better state, right? Minnesota right now is better for a certain person. And if that's the case, if those inequities exist, we have a great education system, right? But for who? Right? Great healthcare system, right? But for who? Mayo, right? World renowned, but for who? Right? So we have to start looking at these things and saying, is it a certain section of Minnesotans, or is it all Minnesota? And so I definitely think people getting involved, whether it's donating to a grassroots level campaign, whether it is campaigning yourself for a candidate you believe in, whatever that looks like, but do it now. Don't wait until August. Don't wait until midterms. Do it right now, because the work that has to be done that really looks like success in November starts right now.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head that it isn't about necessarily even who belongs to what party anymore either, right? It's the element that we need people to do the job. And I think a lot of times we have the same wishes. We all want Minnesota to be great, right? I think you said it, right? But for who? And I think sometimes we got peel back, and we're Minnesotans. Nobody likes conflict. Nobody, like, we just want to like eat the casserole and like nobody like drugs, sweep it under. We're not going to talk about it. Not going to talk about it. We don't want to. But it is a reality for a lot of people. And there are a lot of people that have to live it every single day and have to have it as a conversation. That's a privilege in itself to be able to sweep it under the rug and not have the conversation, right? And so I think it's time for us to really take action around who do we hold accountable, even if we didn't elect them as well. The people that are in representing us, if we didn't vote for them, how do we hold them accountable? How do we make sure that they're because frankly, they were elected to represent everyone, not just the people that voted for them. And
Absolutely.
so it's important that we take into action. I think sometimes people sharing that you've gotten a response, I think that is so incredible, because I think a lot of people feel like, well, they're untouchable. How am I supposed to? How am I supposed to contact them? What am I supposed to say? Or maybe I don't know what to say. I know I believe this and I know that this is important to me, but I don't know how to get there, right? I don't know what action should be taken, but I know something needs to be done. And I think that's the great opportunity to use resources like the Google search bar and listening and having conversations so that you can participate in them. I know that's something that I have been empowered. My family has been active in politics since I was a small child. So for me, I've always known kind of that it is the local elections that you pay attention to. And of course, the presidential election is important, but it really is the people who are in your states making the laws day to day, who are acting and creating the environments that we want. One piece that you and I talked very in-depthly about as well is just the vast homelessness population in the Twin Cities. I didn't share this story with you, but when I was in college, I went on a mission trip to Atlanta, and it was not that far removed from when the Olympics were in Atlanta. Not the Atlantic Olympics. Good Lord, could I speak correctly? So not to age myself, but that's when it was. And what had happened in Atlanta was they had created all of these buildings. And because they didn't want people who were attending the Olympics to know that they were the largest homeless population in the United States, they shoved all these homeless people into a building and blacked out the windows so that nobody could see in. And they weren't allowed out. And I think it is, to your point, I had the opportunity to work in a homeless shelter while I was there. I had a conversation with a man who was in the homeless shelter who had his master's degree, who had worked in leadership before. He was definitely not somebody who hadn't done all of the quote unquote right things. He absolutely had. He was a Christian. He had no criminal record. Like, all of these things added up. And to me, as a young college student, I started to ask myself, why? Why are these things occurring? What can we do to change and make these things different? So let's talk a little bit about that. And then I kind of want to touch on one of the things that you talked about as the wealth gap as well.
Yeah, I think the homelessness issue that we have in Minneapolis is jarring, and it should be awakening to people. And quite frankly, it's a bit sad we don't talk about it as much, right? And because we are home and we're housed and we have heat, it's almost like, well, I can be outside for a couple minutes, I'll think about it, and then I get to go back inside, right? But what we don't remember is, while we're running in from the frigid temperature, somebody's literally outside. And it's come to, I have great friends who have really brought a lot of light and have spread out a lot of information about this, specifically with the camps that they had. And over the summer, many individuals were cooking or bringing food to these camps, and trying to help these individuals, and many of them have been closed down, right? So where are these people going, right? Like, being displaced is difficult for anyone, but there's legitimately nowhere they can go, right? There's children there, and I feel like we've almost lost our humanity, and to some extent our like Minnesota's always talking about how nice and kind we are, but that to me feels very opposite of what we would do. And do I have a solution? Absolutely not. But I don't think taking away their camps is one, right? I don't think taking away what home they do have, especially if we aren't willing to create a different home for them, is what we should be doing. And so I do hope that people who see this or have the opportunity or can find some structural change in how to do something about that do, because it's a very, one, it makes you realize the privilege you do have by being in a home, right? By being in a place where you are housed, where you have consistent food source, where you have a place to go at the end of the day and at night. But it also brings you to the point of, what then do I do about it, right? What can I do about it that's effective? What can I do that creates a better way for this to happen? And also remembering that to somewhat get off of your pedestal, and you just mentioned it, of like, it's not about what the right things are to do in life, which have been societally defined through norms, but really, what can we do? These individuals are, the stories we assume about them are honestly disgusting. And I think we need to come to some sort of understanding of our attitudes and perspectives must shift. And also thinking to ourselves of, how does this differ? Why do you believe that you were any better, that you can never be in this situation, right? Life can change on the drop of a dime. So remembering that you are no better than any other individual, but rather, what can you do for that person, or what can we do to change the situation so that it does not sustain itself, so it doesn't look the same, but really getting off of our pedestals when it comes to it.
Yeah, I think that is, that's a call out of action. And I think that there are so many different organizations out there that are fighting for that space and opportunity. And our homeless populations have only increased after fires and things of that sort from the riots. And so we need to be able to support that community even more from a space of like giving them a place. And we've had recently a building that was set aside to be able to be that space that was then said, nope, just kidding, we're not going to do that. And we look at it from a level of, I look at it from a big picture, 30,000 foot view sometimes. And I think to myself, well, how do we get there? And you mentioned the suppression of information around wealth and money. And it's not the aspect of people not having the tools or resources. It's that it was never made accessible. I think it's about the people that design the information, though, too. And the people that design the information look like me. And so they design the information that is like me and appeases to a population that is like me. But the reality is our population is changing, swiftly changing. And so how do we pivot, and how do we get to this pace where we create more education around understanding and making that accessible? So when you said, and I can't remember if we said this when we were recording or not, because now I'm starting to blend both of the conversations together, but you were talking about financial literacy and education and being able to provide resources. I'd love to hear your thoughts around that a little bit further, and what that could look like, and how we could actually make some lasting change with the next generations to come, and even the current generations that we're in, right? I think oftentimes we focus on the younger generation, but we can actually cause and affect change right now too.
Absolutely. Well, if corporations, for one, can start paying people more, if we want to close a wealth gap that is based on compensation, we start compensating people more. But also in terms of literacy or knowledge, I think there's the parts of which people talk about investments, and I almost like to set that aside, just because sometimes I want to talk to people about life insurance, about Roth IRAs. I talk about 401k. I want to talk about, how do you start to put money in different places, or what is your employer not telling you, or what has no one told you about how to do percentages of how much goes in your 401k, right? Like what makes sense for you? How much do you need to save? Up until what age? What does that look like? And those to me are more of the long-term things we can do to make sure that happens. And then when we talk about investments, I struggle a bit because people, I think, especially my generation, are looking for a very quick turnover, right? Like no one wants to really put their money in bonds. No one really wants to
Oh,
do
that's
the
sexy.
like,
Why would you put your money in bonds?
everyone's just like waiting for the like the stock market, like right when we've been talking about right now, right, with Pfizer putting out this vaccine with the presidential election, like what are stocks going to move? Like I want to get on top of that, right? There's this very like you said, this very sexy image of the stock market. I mean, what people don't know, and then we talk about like, well, actually, that's really like subordinated by like the fixed income market, right? And what's going on there, and then that's really subordinated by like real estate, right? And so talking to people about like, if you are at a point in which you do have excess funds or discretionary money, and you might not have access to a wealth advisor, right? And how do we talk about how, I mean, and you're obviously in, you've seen wealth advising, right? And I've talked to different individuals, and I was talking to someone from Wellington Management once, and I was saying like, it's not even a matter of the funds might not exist. It's that there's a threshold at which point somebody will advise you, right? And
Yep.
for people to get to that level of discretionary funds would mean that they're being compensated in their necessities and in their requirements in a very different level, right? So again, we start to see this gap increase because there's no way I'm going to reach that threshold to be advised yet. And so how do I gain this knowledge by myself? But then how do we work to make sure individuals get that? So I think once corporations start compensating people more and give them the proper information on what those savings are, right? The importance of these things like life insurance, the importance of like your Roth IRA, the importance of your 401k, and why all these things matter. And then start to talk to individuals about discretionary funds and about investments, and telling people it does not have to be hundreds of thousands of dollars, right?
Correct. Yeah.
It does not, you do not need to have hundreds of thousands of dollars to invest or to flip your money or whatever the case is. And it's also okay not to get this, the return that people are expecting in 2 years. It's okay to let your money sit, and it will reward you in time.
Compounding interest is a very good thing, especially if you're starting in your early 20s. You're going to have more money than a lot of people in their 50s if you just let it sit.
Exactly.
It's amazing. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, one of my colleague who I work with at the Carlson School would be, he said that there's, the 7 world wonders, obviously. And he said the 8th one is compound interest. So
yeah.
I know I have to tell him, he always makes that. And I was like, you're right. If you figure out how that works for you and you start early, you benefit.
Absolutely. And I would think that, I think that it's not just your generation though, too, that people, there's a lot of get rich quick type of mentality out there. And the reality is getting rich quick happens for very few individuals. And a lot of the clients that I have served throughout my career have really just saved and not spent a lot of money. And so sometimes I think it even comes back. I tenfold agree with you on the income side of things, because I've had conversations where people are like, how do I get out of debt? And I'm like, well, you need to make more money. And that's the reality of it. And I think that's why the side hustle has become a full-time hustle sometimes, right? Because people consequently aren't being compensated for the things that they need. And some of this is just basic needs and student loan debt that people have. And I think that that's another conversation to have as early as college, right? Like, how are you planning to pay for this? And what does this look like? Don't hurdle yourself into debt once you graduate from college, so that you don't start off in a good space to be able to build yourself wealth. Because who can afford out of college $1,000 student loan payment and rent, where you're looking to rent unless you have a roommate, right?
Right.
You're looking at the same cost, if not more. So,
Exactly.
I just saw a 2-bedroom condo in Northeast for $1,600, and I'm just like flabbergasted, because I remember what a 2-bedroom apartment cost my roommate and I in college, which was half of that. So, and I, again, don't think I'm that old, but clearly I am, because inflation has occurred.
Inflation hasn't changed as much as
cost of living has.
Yes. I strongly do not believe inflation and cost of living are positively correlated in the right way.
No, they're not in the sense of where we have been since 2008, right? Prior to that, we probably saw a little bit more historical correlation. I think that that's why our industry has to start pivoting and looking at things in a little bit of a different sense. And you mentioned some core principles that are the foundation of financial planning, and it's really defining, how do you diversify yourself? How do you make sure that you have multiple streams of income? How are you making sure that you have choices and options of where you can take assets from, no matter what age you're at? We focus a lot about that in retirement, but when you go to buy your first home, or you get married, if that is something that you want to do, when you have children, when you put your children in college, when you lose a job and you have to have supplemental income. These are all basis of financial planning, which I think is so critical. And for, the younger generation, it's really hard because you want to talk about financial planning and they're like, but nobody wants to talk to me about it because I don't have a minimum to make. And that was part of the reason why I left corporate America, so that I could have a space to help plan individuals who didn't have the assets. Because there were a huge demographic I could never meet with because they didn't meet my minimum. And that goes directly back to what you were saying. And I think that it's important that my job is to help people accumulate wealth. So, how can I not help a younger generation to get to that space either? So values, checking our values with what we want to be able to do in our life. So as we wrap up this conversation, because I feel like I could talk to you all day long about different things. And I can't wait to see where the rest of the school year brings you and where the future brings you. I have no doubt that it is incredibly bright, and I cannot wait to see the impacts that you make. And remember that even those small impacts are huge impacts that line up. I don't know, have you ever taken an Enneagram? I'm curious of what your Enneagram is.
Oh, no, I haven't.
So an Enneagram is like these 9 different personality types.
Okay.
I have a speculation of what you might be. I won't tell you, but you should go take the Enneagram.
Okay.
It's like my favorite. It's kind of like a strengths finder. But I feel like it's just a little bit more approachable. I'm a 3, which is an achiever, and a 2, which is a helper. So they play off of each other in that perspective. But what would you, I digress. This happens very frequently. So thank you, listeners, for always constantly staying with me as I rabbit hole into something else. But let's wrap it up, Jael, and you tell us what are things that, encouraging notes that you would take forward as we continue to have these hard conversations and move forward towards more of an equitable culture.
Absolutely. I think there has to be a conversation on what is, I think we have to stop politicizing the matter. And the reason I say this is because what happened, the murder of George Floyd was nonpartisan. Murder is nonpartisan. I want to be very clear. I've sat in conversations where people want to politicize, and they said, no, that was murder. And that's a nonpartisan issue, and it should be. What I feel like people lack is humanity. And what we don't realize is we came into this world the same way. We were not born to the same privilege. We were not born with the same rights. We were not given the same thing. And these systems were not designed for all of us. But we were born the very same way, right? And when we die, it's going to be the very same way. Now, in between that time, right, people like to say in between the dash, which honestly feels a little dark to me sometimes, but in between
that is a little dark.
You know what I mean? A little. But in between that time, it's all about who you are and the humanity that you show, how you treat people, what you do. But it's looking at someone and saying, our nation used to treat you as 3/5 a person, right? But what I'm choosing to do, right, the perspective I carry forth treats you as an equal person. But these systems are inequitable. So what do we do that makes an equitable approach to make sure that you get to where you need to be, right? I understand my privilege. I understand now where I sit. How do we start to move in spaces in which I am to make sure that you can access them? And it's not to say that your oppressor is then your helper, but it's to say in where they exist and in the spaces that they are, they start to change them. And the advocacy and what is said, like you said, listening, right? It's okay to ask questions. In fact, I'd rather have you fail in asking the questions and I correct you than you sit with that thought and you believe it's correct. And in many times we've sat in conversations and people are afraid to say something. And I understand it. There seems to be a call out culture, but I can only correct you. I can only assist you. I can only help you if I know what you think, if I know where your head is at, because we have to see each other as people. We have to be kind to one another. You have to figure this out. Everyone has their place in how they feel. No one's feelings are invalid. People are allowed to be angry. People are allowed to be mad. People are allowed to be frustrated. If you look at the history of our country, in fact, it sometimes is baffling to me what Black Americans, what African Americans, what Black people all over the world have sustained, but still continue to ask for basic rights. Angela Rice said something that was so key to me. She said, this country promises life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we're still stuck at life. Right? We're merely asking for respect on our life. And for somebody to ask you to validate their mere existence is starking to me. Honestly, it's starking. And that should not be something that somebody should actually have to expect. It should be something that is granted. Right. And so I think when we come into these conversations, let it be a conversation on humanity. And when you take it down to humanity and you stop talking to me about maybe the statistics, or maybe what perspective was shared, or maybe the racist ideology that has been constantly put forth, or maybe you stop romanticizing MLK and we talk about what really happened. And when you look at the fact that Black people are being killed, and we talk about what's happening, we talk about what we're showing our children in the media, and we talk about how people are talking to one another, then you start to see the problems. Then you start to see that the very people that are being oppressed are simply asking for their very basic right to life. And in that, I don't think there should be a partisan issue. To that, I don't think we can make it political. To that, I believe everyone should sit there and be able to understand that, because no one would want to sit there and say that my life doesn't matter more than yours.
Right.
And we shouldn't. So I think as people move forward into conversations, make it a conversation on humanity, remove your political beliefs, and for 1 second, think about, what does this mean to somebody's life? And how have I contributed either to being life-giving or life-depleting?
Oh, I love that. I love that last part. I think humanity is so key to everything. And you brought it up earlier that the people who have come before you have done so much for you to be able to, and you don't want to stand aside and not do the same thing for the children and grandchildren of your future. And I constantly say to myself, when my daughters are older and they ask me, Mommy, what did you do? I don't want to be complacent. And so I think that humanity and your words are so critical. Jael, thank you. Thank you for your wisdom. Where can, if people want to follow your journey of what you are doing and what you're committed to, because I have a feeling that a few of our listeners are going to want to see the success that you achieve in your life. So where can people hang out with you?
Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, wherever, LinkedIn. Connect with me on LinkedIn. That's probably where you're going to be able to follow the journey the best. And honestly, I hope once COVID is over and I'm able to move on, I love meeting with people. I love talking to different groups and hearing perspectives. And I've sat in many rooms where we have not always agreed on opinion, and that's okay. My job is not to invalidate your opinion, but to make sure that you hear mine. And make sure that we can sit there and come together and respect one another. But one thing I will never argue on is a matter of life, however that's taken or that exists. And so in that, I would love to connect with people, even if that's over Zoom, but people can follow my journey on all social media.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you.